If you've spent any time in MedTech, you've seen it. Brilliant technology, strong clinical promise, great early excitement, and then it stalls. Not because the science failed, not because the market wasn't there, but because the business never came together. That's what this episode is about. Today's conversation is different. We're not talking about wearables. We're not talking about another CEO journey. We're breaking down the operational playbook behind successful MedTech companies from idea to commercialization to exit. Because the truth is, innovation alone doesn't win in this space. Integration does. My guest today, Brent Lavin, has built his career at the intersection of clinical, regulatory, product, and commercial strategy, what he calls the integrator role. And in this episode, we unpack why most MedTech innovation fails before it ever reaches scale, how to kill bad ideas early, even when they look promising, what actually happens when clinical, regulatory, and commercial teams fall out of alignment, and how the best companies build with the exit in mind from day one. This is a masterclass for operators, for founders, for product leaders, for anyone trying to turn great technology into real business. Let's get into it. Brent, really appreciate you joining. I want to start with something you've been very vocal about, the integrator. Break that down for us. What is it, and why do most companies miss it?
Yeah, thanks, Joe. I really appreciate this conversation and to bring more information together around the integrator role. And I think in MedTech, because of some of the specialization and the silos that have evolved as the industry has progressed, we are missing a critical piece that brings people together between R&D excellence, clinical, regulatory, supply chain operations. MedTech has only gotten more and more complex and more specialized. But as we've done that, we haven't necessarily always brought those functions together to operate as a single business unit. And so that's been my experience over the last 20 years, blending my engineering background and my commercial mindset to help teams gain alignment and execute according to the business plan.
Well, it seems like your career has been well guided by this principle. Now, if we apply that, let's talk about, innovation. Why do you think some innovation without integration fails?
Listen, there's no shortage of ideas from brilliant engineers, technologists, even salespeople. Anybody can come up with great ideas. But it takes a real special skill set to guide an idea to a business. And so I've had examples in my career where we've had a brilliant technology that we frankly needed to evaluate, but then ultimately sideline because there was no business model and no way to make money from that. And so that's a level of discernment to be able to separate from what is a good idea and to say, can we make a business out of this? And I've operated in that zone where I can appreciate the technology, but then also be really cogent about whether there's a business model to match up with it.
Well, that draws us right into the myth out there that great technology sells itself, right? So when you think about that and you think about the core of what you've done over your career, it doesn't sell itself. It needs some structure. It needs the right foundation.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you could look internally at the pieces that need to align for a product to be successful in the market. But I think you could also look externally within the healthcare system. And so, externally, it needs to fit into a reimbursement and market access climate. It needs to satisfy a value analysis committee that's ultimately going to approve it for the hospital. And it even comes down to the cath lab or the procedure room, where technologists in the background have to make a choice about whether to pull your product or the competitor's product. And there can be little things along the way that if the user interface is confusing or if the product doesn't fit on the wire very well, there can be people along that journey that say, you know what, I just want to stick with the status quo. I don't want to adapt this new technology, even though it may be better ultimately for patient care. They are running a business and an operation within the procedure room.
Well, share with us the role of a product manager as the connective tissue across clinical, regulatory, quality, and commercial teams. How does that work? I mean, What does a good product manager do?
I think a good product manager acts as the general manager of a product line, and they're ultimately guarding the business case that you're trying to set up for a particular product line. So I think they're able to integrate the perspectives of R&D, clinical, regulatory, all of these specialized functions, and bring that together to optimize for that particular product line. And so they're not acting in the silo of what's best for a particular function, but they're acting in the interests of what's best for the customer and ultimately the business. And so I view everything through really the business model. And so everything should be contained within, the cost and revenue function of a business model. And you should be able to model that out. And so a good product manager keeps a very holistic view in guiding this product line from concept to commercialization in order to achieve a business model.
Well, easier said, right? From concept to commercialization and all the required steps in between to help support that commercial effort. When you think of good ideas and how they originate, where do you feel that they need to be pressure tested? And how often do you review that result and say, let's move forward, or we don't think that this is a good product to move forward?
Joe, I'd answer that question in two ways. I would talk about from the structure and theory, and then I'll talk about it in a real life example. I subscribe and had the fortune of attending the Stanford Biodesign class. And right in there, we're looking to solve a significant problem for a sufficiently sized patient population with a demonstrable outcome. And so that's the first set of tests that we're going to put towards an innovation. Are we actually solving a real problem for a population? And can we demonstrate that in an outcome, whether that's clinical or bench or competitive? But the real world example I would give was, a technology that we had over a decade ago that was a really interesting and cool needle guidance technology for ultrasound guided procedures. And it was theoretically better for the physician. But when we went out and pressure tested it with real doctors, they essentially said, nice to have, not need to have. They were comfortable enough with the procedure that they didn't really need this technology. They said, if you give it to me, I'll take it, but I'm not going to pay extra for it. And so that's where this breaks down in practice is you can't tie that to a business model. And we ultimately had to re-review that project and cancel it eventually because we couldn't make money at it.
So these are the real life signals that you need to be aware of. And I think what I've seen in my career is that many of these signals go ignored. Only really good product managers will address it head on and make that tough decision of, do we really see some commercial traction here? Or do we put this to bed and maybe redesign something else? So when things break, how's a good product manager work?
Yeah, great question. I like to deal in reality. And while I am an optimist and I'd like to think that, innovation can solve a lot of problems, I'm also a realist. When you put on scrubs and you talk to physicians and you visit labs, and especially with really good salespeople, you start to understand the objections that are either said or unsaid, and then deal with reality. Because ultimately, I felt responsible for the business model that I presented to the company. And so if I don't believe that that business model is possible, I'd rather deal with that reality sooner rather than later, because that's ultimately kind of my, reputation. And so I just presented back to the business the reality of what I found in the lab. And that's often, again, working with good salespeople, because I think salespeople are naturally good at understanding objections and understanding the nice to have versus the need to have. And if they're not enthusiastic about selling this product, that's a massive red flag for me that I want to continue to evaluate and pressure test.
Well, it sounds like working in this intersection between the clinical, regulatory, and also integrating those salespeople in there is exactly what contributes to your success, right? So when you work in that intersection, that integrator role, I'd love you to think of an example where a product you may not have thought that would have succeeded, but through good product management, good positioning, good marketing, you've made success out of it. Is there a good example you could share with us?
That's a great question. I'll point back to an acquisition that we did in 2020, where there was an atherectomy product on the market in the European and Asian markets that was not yet approved in the U.S. And we ended up purchasing this company and bringing it to the U.S. in 2020 in a very, very crowded segment of peripheral vascular. And this was the seventh product for that indication. And to be honest, we had to get really creative about how we were going to position this. And so what we ultimately did is picked a niche indication within peripheral vascular and positioned it for that specific application. We didn't try to attack broadly, but very specifically. And that happened to be in-stent restenosis and mixed morphology. And so we said for those types of lesions, this is the best product for these various reasons. And so I think that's an example where instead of trying to boil the ocean, we got really specific and said, for these types of patients, we're the best option. And we ended up being very successful with that launch because we talked specifically to the problem that we were solving.
Yeah, I mean, when you think about much of the technology that's developed, yes, there's some de novo products that come out, and that's a dream to manage and sell. But when you think about crowded and noisy markets, this is where your value really comes in. Well, I would say you're valuable across the board, but the value comes into positioning, taking the right approach in the market, and then developing the market within that as a segue to the entry. So it sounds like that was incredibly successful. Now, lessons learned, right? So across your career, we all have had lessons learned. What are the top 2 or 3 lessons that you have learned that have carried you across different projects?
Yeah, thanks for that question. Wow. I would say that there's strength in numbers. And I would say that there's power in all of the various perspectives that you can bring into that room. And MedTech is a team sport. And so the more that you can bring people with expertise and perspective into the room and troubleshoot together, that's going to be the most powerful thing. It's too complex for one person to kind of know it all. And the more that you can bring people together under a shared goal and work through those really challenging circumstances, they're inevitably going to occur. There is much power in that. And then I would also go back to the lesson of understanding the nice to have versus the need to have, and being very clear about separating those two things when you go out and do customer research and getting feedback along the process. And so those are the 2 things that I would highlight.
Seems like much of what we've just outlined are along the path to commercialization. So let's talk about, the exciting time of creating a commercial plan, right? So what commercialization strategies do you take for success?
Yeah, I think it starts with really the science behind, the product that you've created, the problem that you are addressing with the technology. And so starting from a segmentation approach, what are we actually doing from a science perspective? And then, what have you developed from a baseline of proof, whether that's, clinical data, bench data, competitive data, and then working strongly with the sales teams to understand how you take a physician from interest to activation. And that in my world generally includes awareness. How do they become aware of it? And then there's usually a demonstration. And so have we created a really compelling benchtop or video or something that compels them to move toward maybe an evaluation, right? And so what does that evaluation look like? Is it 5 patients? Is it 15 patients? Is it 25 patients? And then ultimately adoption. And so the ultimate place that you're trying to get to is adoption in a world where they're choosing your product, whether you're in the room or not. And I think that's where, some early and complex technology fails is if somebody is not in the room, they're not choosing your product. And that's not a scalable business. And so those are the things that I think about with commercialization is how we walk physicians and support staff and everybody through this process toward that independent usage.
Yeah, and those are the value propositions that you wrap around the technology and make sure it's appropriately communicated. And that's the value prop that you want them to have at the forefront of their thoughts when they're about to choose your product versus a competitor. What goes along with that is, the value analysis, preparation, and pricing models that reflect the customer preference. So how's this also tie in?
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up because that has significantly changed over the last 10 to 15 years. And I think if you're developing a product, even at the early stages, without consideration of the economics and the value analysis committee and pricing models that you're going to use, it can quickly break down at that step. And so I'd first of all start by understanding the site of service economics. And in many of our markets, that is shifting quickly in a good way from the hospital towards the ASC, ambulatory surgery center, and the OBLs, the office-based labs. And so understanding where that is and where that's going is going to be key as you develop those models. I would also say if you're designing clinical trials, to be very proactive about building in endpoints that are ultimately going to support that business case. And so we often design clinical trials for approval purposes, but we're missing a massive opportunity if we don't include data for commercialization purposes. And so that's just a lost opportunity. You can generally get data as secondary and observational endpoints for free. And then the last piece that I would say, Joe, is I'd really understand if your product has a capital and disposable component, how that contracting process is going to work. I think it's really simple to say we will contract through a disposable contract over a period of time for usage. However, it's maybe easy to sign that contract, but is it enforceable? And so some of those things need to be an early consideration as you think about the sunk costs of capital going into a lab in order to support your product. So I know there's a lot there, but it's complex and definitely needs to be considered, early and throughout the project.
Well, there's a couple things I heard there I'd like to dive in on. Two of them. One of them is the ambulatory surgical center. Over the last 2 to 3 years, there's been an incredible shift in the amount of ASCs that are opening. And then there's also been a shift by CMS to allow these centers to do more and more work. And the reimbursement looks pretty good that I'm seeing these ASC codes that are coming out and being funded more and more. So when we think about the ASCs, and then you also made reference to, I'd like to dive in on a bit, are endpoints of clinical studies. Let's talk about the ASC. Well, let's talk about the clinical endpoints first, okay?
Sure.
When creating these endpoints, what happens when the path to reach that endpoint begins to shift? How do you manage that?
Yeah, Joe, I appreciate that. I think, again, it goes back to beginning with the end in mind. And so what is your ultimate value proposition? And if part of your value proposition is operational efficiency, then that needs to be considered as part of a secondary or observational endpoint. If part of your value proposition is patient satisfaction, then you need to be including a patient quality of life indicator in there. And I know the FDA and CMS is pushing companies to have more patient-reported outcomes. And so it will be looked on favorably by the agency. And so being proactive about including those things and collecting them in order to support your value proposition goes a long way, saves you costs, and ultimately you get out what you are looking for in the end.
So thank you for sharing. And the other question I had was about ASCs. We see it funded more. There really more and more procedures are shifting from the brick and mortar of hospitals into the ASC locations. How do you adjust in your strategy to speak to those procedures being done out of the ASC?
Yeah, I think first and foremost, it goes back to the economics of the ASC, to your point. They are being supported, but ultimately the reimbursement for those procedures is generally lower than the hospital. And so as a business, if you have a certain margin expectation, you just need to operate within that framework. ASCs and OBLs may be interested in a de-featured product, which may be at a different price point than your primary offering for the hospital in order to achieve the same procedure. And then the other thing I would say is when it comes to commercial operations, it's important to understand how the ASC does business. Are they expecting consignment, or are they willing to purchase outright? And how do they want to do business? Because that informs your supply chain plan and your internal planning when it comes to how much product to produce.
So when you think about, so let's take this and let's shift a bit. And thank you for sharing. And much of where we're heading is now about the exit, right? So building acquisition readiness early in the life cycle. How do you do that? Taking into consideration different call points, hospitals, say hospitals and ASCs. You have your strategy, you have your studies with your primary and secondary endpoints. But where does the acquisition readiness come in the life cycle?
Yeah, thanks. I think that's an excellent question. And so I'm going to skip over some of the science and the value proposition and the clinical data that you've generated and really focus on the sales efficiencies that I think the large strategics are looking for. And so it ultimately comes down to that segmentation, targeting, and positioning. And so, Joe, to your point before, it's important to be really specific about the segment that we're serving and how efficiently we can gain interest, demo, do in-service, and gain adoption. And so that's ultimately what a strategic is looking for is how many accounts have you approached? How have you been successful? How long has it taken for you to work through that process, whether that's value analysis committees or whatnot? So how long does adoption take? And how much of the market have you not approached? And how much is remaining? Because ultimately a strategic is looking at this asset to say, can I put it in my distribution channel, pour gas on it, and grow this even faster? And so to the degree that you can have a clean story around the efficiency of the commercial effectiveness, it's going to go a lot further with a strategic.
Brent, why don't you share with us, where do you think things break down? And in your experience, how do you circumvent that?
Yeah, great question. I mean, I've seen 200 and 250 pitches from various startups, over the years. And I think that one thing I would point out is that, the pitch really, the most effective pitches are specific to the strategic. So they understand the strategic's world in terms of their portfolio, their call points, their sales structure, even past transactions. And so the more that they can customize that pitch and fit within the current strategic structure, the more receptive it's going to be. I would also say one of the other things that I talk about quite a bit with early stage is understanding the margin expectations and margin pressures at a strategic. And so often we would receive pitches that say, we have line of sight to 70% margin or line of sight to X. And I understand the need to continue to build that, but the strategics really want it at that margin level the day that they acquire it. And so I think sometimes that's an afterthought from early stage. But the more that they can put in toward establishing the margin at the time of the transaction, the more effective it's going to be.
Do you see that margins typically, through the companies I've led, as we develop and as we grow, those margins begin to compress, right? So you get better margins as the volume starts to move. Your vendors start to give you some pricing discounts. Does that have any positive impact in your experience?
Yeah, I think it does. And I think, we expect that as a larger company to be able to work with those margins. At the same time, it comes with some more complex processes from quality management and some of the other supply chain considerations. And so we don't necessarily bank on it. And so while it will happen, it may take 2, 3, 4 years to become reality. And so while in a startup, it's actually much easier to get your margin in order than to rely on the strategic to use their buying power to get it to a certain point.
So how much do you think that, we start talking about margins and EBITDA, what makes this attractive? What are the attractive items that most buyers are looking at when you begin talking economics?
Yeah, I would say that, first of all, even before that, and we talked a little bit about it before, it has to be a great portfolio fit. It has to extend their reach within the call point or to extend their reach across the disease state. And so it has to be a strategic portfolio fit. And then ideally, it's going to be accretive to those product margins and accretive to EBITDA because you're amortizing distribution costs across a broader revenue range. And so ultimately, it's a game of 1 and 1 equals 3. And so how those economics work is it's margin accretive at the product level. And then because the distribution costs are amortized, it's greater at the EBITDA level.
Thank you for sharing. I'd like to shift to talk about Ironwood MedTech. This is your company and your services and the wealth of experience you have. You operate through Ironwood. So tell us a bit about Ironwood, if you can. Thank you, Brent.
Thank you. Yeah, I've really appreciated and enjoyed, the 20 years of product development innovation and M&A at strategic medtech companies. But about 6 months ago, I formed Ironwood MedTech Partners in order to provide fractional leadership and services to seed through Series B funded medtech startups, where I can play a leadership role at the intersection of product, innovation, M&A, and many of the things that we talked about here, to be an integrator and to help guard the business case as the company continues to make trade-offs throughout the development project toward ultimately reaching, an exit process. And so whether the problem is solving at the intersection of a failed clinical trial endpoint or figuring out what the clinical trial needs to look like, or whether that's creating a go-to-market plan prior to approval so that once approval hits, we can hit the ground running. That's the goal of Ironwood MedTech, is to plug in on a fractional basis and help solve bringing the experience that I have from those strategic medtechs.
So I've taken a few notes as I was, researching the company more. And, I see here we have, navigating milestones, funding rounds, commercialization readiness, exit preparation. I mean, these are incredibly important items that need to be in capable hands. So through your experience, these seem to be the top 4 or 5 items you're most proficient with. Is there anything that I'm not covering here that you certainly would like the listeners to know of?
Yeah, no, thank you. And those are all things that I enjoy. And sometimes, just simply being a thought partner and providing more analysis behind various options is exactly what the company needs. There's maybe a gut feel of the direction that they should go, but they want to evaluate options A, B, and C. And I can help provide some analytics and perspective from an outsider's view that might help fuel that analysis. I would also say one of the other things that I'm really passionate about is strategic customer discovery throughout the program. And I think we do that very early in programs, of course, in order to get design inputs. But to your question before, are we doing that throughout the project in order to continue to evaluate our hypotheses and our beliefs? And as reimbursement changes, as competitors change, as just the landscape changes in healthcare, have we reevaluated whether this is still true and whether we should still proceed with exactly what we've developed? And so I can definitely help with strategic customer insights and that process to help gain confidence in what's being developed.
Well, thank you for sharing. I think the culmination of your experience that's going to work through Ironwood is going to be a value for any organization that decides to engage with you on that. And I want to once again thank you for being on Rounds. It was nice to have you on and taking a look at a masterclass of a playbook on how to best commercialize a product, and then through that commercial effort, what are the various milestones to keep an eye on. So Brent, thank you for your time. Look forward to the success of Ironwood MedTech.
Joe, it's been such a pleasure. I really enjoyed this conversation, and I hope that we stay in touch.
Excellent. Thank you.